Hey everybody, I'm recording a little extra video because I gave this demo in my lab section, and then of course I forgot to hit record when I did the demo. So I thought I'd redo it and make it available to everyone, just in case you weren't still logged into my lab section when we did the demo. So the thing I want to show today is copying files on the same computer using a command called cp, and then we're going to use a similar command called scp to use SSH to copy files between computers. So for lab 1 and lab 2, it's been okay for your lab submissions if you've just, catted the file that you've edited remotely, copied and pasted it into BlackBoard or whatever. But this isn't going to work when you have to start submitting code, because you'll have lots of source files and make files, which we'll talk about next week. And this would be annoying to have to do. So instead, let's talk about how to copy files first on the same computer. So what I have here is two windows open. So here down at the bottom, I have a terminal open on my local machine, which is my Mac. And then up here, I've got an SSH connection to the student server, just like we've been doing since the very first lecture. So down here, I've got a file called defineexpansion.c. The contents of the file doesn't really matter to us here, just because we're going to be using it just to copy files from one place to another. But if we were to look at the file, it's in fact just the preprocessor expansion example that we saw in lecture the other day. But it doesn't matter. So there is a Unix utility that we haven't talked about, but it's in the Sobel text if you're interested in seeing about it. And it's called cp. cp, of course, is short for copy. And so the man page, of course, will tell you how to use all the different flags. Really, we're just interested in the two arguments here. The first argument to cp is the source, that is to say the file that you want to copy. And the destination, the second argument, is the path where you would like that file to be copied. So for instance, over here, I can run cp define expansion. And let's say we want to copy it to another location in the same current working directory. Now, of course, two files can't have the same name if they're in the same directory, so we'd have to give it a different name. So we could just say, other.c, something like that, for instance. So what this is saying is cp is going to copy the contents of defineexpansion.c and place that in another file, which I've just chosen to be other.c. So now we see there are now two files, and if we were to open up other.c, of course, it's the same file that we saw a moment ago. Of course, we can copy files to different directories. There's no reason why we can only copy things within some particular directory. So if I were to run cp defineexpansion.c, maybe we want to copy this to the parent directory. And in this case, there's no name collision between defineexpansion.c being a file in the parent directory and the original defineexpansion.c that we've got here. So there's no reason why I can't copy this to the parent directory. So we can do .. So that's the relative path to the parent directory. I can say defineexpansion.c, getting a little kind of scrolling over to the next line here, but that's okay. And what this will do is this will copy the file, defineexpansion.c, into the parent directory with the name defineexpansion.c. Now, one thing that we can do here is, because we are specifying a path can either be a directory or a file. If we only give it a directory, so for instance, .. refers just to the parent directory, that's the path to the parent directory. This isn't a file, unlike what we had before, where we had other.c or defineexpansion.c. That would be a path to some file. But because this is a path to a directory that already exists, cp will copy the file to the directory specified with the path and give it the same name. So if I were to run this command here, and I go down a directory, what we see here, so defineexpansion is my current working directory. Defineexpansion.c is the file that we just copied. And how that worked was CP said, the destination path is a directory, so I'm going to reuse the file name from the source and write a file with that name in the destination directory. So that's how CP works. There's also a variation called move, which does a similar thing, but then it also deletes the source file. Again, all of this is in the subel text if you want to read more about it. But the thing that's interesting to us is copying between different computers. And CP does not let us do this. There is instead a command called scp. So secure copy is what it stands for. And the S can also be thought of as SSH. So remember how we use SSH to open a terminal on a different computer? SCP uses that same network protocol not to open up a terminal, not to send those teletypewriter protocol messages that we talked about, when we talked about time-sharing operating systems, but instead to copy the contents of the file from one place to another. All right, so let me go up here to the student server. So I'm in the top here. I have nothing in this directory here. But let's say that we want to copy, let me remove other.c there, no need to have that around. So let's say we want to copy define expansion.c, not to some path on our computer here, not on my Mac, but up here on the student server instead. So the basic syntax for SCP is remarkably similar. The first argument is going to be the source path, which for us will just be define expansion.c. So far this looks exactly like what we were doing with CP. Now the thing that we need to do here is we need to specify the path on a particular remote host, so we need to give a host name. We also need to give, because it's using the SSH protocol, we also need to give the username that we're going to use to log in over SSH to send that file over. So let's say we want to drop this into the directory demo, which is in my home directory. So we're going to want to log in as TaylorN5 on students.cs.mcewan.ca, and we're going to want to specify that we want to drop the file in here. So the way that we do this is actually pretty similar to how we use SSH. So to interact with the student server over SSH as TaylorN5, we know how to do this because we've used this when we've logged in using SSH. It's going to be TaylorN5 at students.cs.mcewan.ca. And the thing that we want to do is place this file in my home directory, or in the subdirectory demo in my home directory. So there's something we need to place there in, but we'll talk about that in a second. And the thing that we want is /demo. So the convention is, this specifies the remote location of the server. So we're going to use the TaylorN5 user account on students.cs. And the way that we separate the path on that machine from how to get to that machine is with the colon. So the colon, we say, delimits those two parts of the path. And if we were to open up the SCP man page, we can actually see that that's encoded in the synopsis of the man page. So the user at some particular host, and then that colon separating the host name from the file that we want to copy to. So let's run this and see what happens. So just to remind us what we're doing, we are SCPing the file on my Mac, defineexpansion.c, to /demo on students.ca.mcewan.ca, cs.mcewan.ca, and we're going to log in as TaylorN5. All right, so what we saw here is we copied over defineexpansion.c, and we have some informational facts, like it took 54 kilobytes per second to copy this file over. So if I run ls back up on the student server, I see defineexpansion.c. So that's how we've copied a file from our local machine to a remote machine. Now let's talk about how to do it the other way. How do we copy a file from our remote machine to our Mac at home, or our personal computer at home. So just to, let's imagine that we had done lab 2. So I'm going to create a file on the student server called report. And let's just fill it with some content. CMPT 201 lab 2 report. A great lab 2 lab report. So I will save and exit that file in Vim. So ~demo/report is now the path to this report file that we want to have locally on our computer. And remember, the reason why we want to be able to copy this file back is so that we don't have to say cat the report file, copy its contents, and then paste it into BlackBoard. That's annoying, and it's not going to work very well when you have a lot of source files that you're going to be editing on the student server that you want to submit to BlackBoard. So remember how SCP works. We want to specify first the path to the file that we want to copy, and then the path including the host name and the username and all that sort of stuff that's indicating the remote location that we want to copy that file to. Okay, so what is the path of the file on the student server? Well, we can just say report, whoops, SCP report. Now this is where things get a little bit tricky, because we don't necessarily know the host name of our student server. We know the host name of our student server, but not of our personal computer here. That requires setting up something called, a DNS record for our host name. Maybe we know our IP address at home, but then you've got to set up port forwarding and all this sort of awkward networking stuff that's not really the thing that we want to do. So running SCP with a local source and a remote destination is actually not the thing that we want to do here. We can do it, but that would require setting up a whole bunch of networking stuff that isn't necessary. So what I'm going to do down here is instead run SCP. And the thing we're going to do is specify the file that we want copied, which is on the student server, so Taylor N5, at students.cs.MacEwan.ca /demo report. Right? So this is the file that we want copied. Right? So there's no reason why the remote path has to be the destination. It can also be the source path. So what this means is that we're going to pull this file over SSH. And where do we want this file to go? Well, let's say maybe we just want to put it in our current working directory, which is just dot. So when we run this SCP, what we've done is we've asked SCP to grab this file and copied it over into the current working directory. So if I run ls, we see report here. And I can cat the report file, and it's exactly the same thing that we had on the student server. So we've used SCP in two ways. The first way was that we had a local file that we wanted to push to some remote location. And in the second example, we had a remote file that we wanted to pull from a remote location to a local one. And if you did the optional part in Lab 1, of course, you could specify the shorthand alias that you set up in SSH config. So for me, that would just be MacEwan /report, and this will still work because I set up my SSH config to alias MacEwan to this path here. That was part 3 of Lab 1 if you did it. So hopefully this is useful. If you haven't submitted Lab 2 yet, feel free to give this a shot. You'll certainly be making use of this in later labs and for submitting your assignments as well. So if you have questions, shoot me a mail. We can talk about this in lab as well. Apart from that, have a good week and see you all on Monday.